Lately, there's been a lot of buzz about a book that Darwin never finished. Most people are unaware that Darwin actually wrote multiple books. Butterflies, barnacles, coral reefs, the origin of species, books about the evolution of people, books about emotions in animals and man. I mean, he wrote a lot of different books. And most people are also not aware that the origin of species was just an abstract. It wasn't the finished product. He was just putting out a concept, and he promised multiple times that he was going to write a long defense of evolution according to natural selection, the actual evidence for his theory, but he never completed it. Now, the manuscript was found in his study after his death, and it was finally published in 1975, like 100 years after he failed to complete it. He's going to look at 10 different organisms and show how natural selection worked in each of these organisms. But the data were not appearing. The information he required was not actually there. And so this new book came out, Darwin's Bluff, The Mystery of the Book Darwin Never Finished, by Robert Schettinger. I mean, it's an amazing thing. The fact that the father of evolution according to natural selection could not actually defend his own theory. Oh, there's so much about Darwin's life that's fascinating, but I don't want to look at Darwin specifically. Let's look at the theory more. Well, hey, I'm Dr. Rob. Welcome to Biblical Genetics. Today I am on a tropical island. I'm on the island of Roatan, just off the north coast of Honduras. I had the privilege of speaking at a church on Sunday, and I got a tour of their orphanage, their drug rehab center, the new church they're building, another church that's far up a road, that the farther up the road you go, the poorer the people get and the worse the living conditions get. They have a church way up there perched on this hill overlooking the ocean. It's a beautiful view. If you were a millionaire, you would have put a house there, but lots of thousands of other people live there now. And they're migrating in from the island, from the country of Honduras, to come to this island where there's opportunity for economic advancement, for improvement. Basically, there's a bunch of rich Europeans that live here, and there's money to be made, and so people are coming here, and I don't fault them for that. But it's a lovely place with a lot of need and a lot of disparities between the rich and the poor. But that's just the island where I am at the moment. And while I'm here, we have a rainy day. It's kind of getting tropical, so I'm not going scuba diving today like I did yesterday and the day before. And so I had to sit down and film an episode for you. And this episode is going to be about the failure of natural selection. But I'm going to highlight a brand new paper. A paper written by some very high profile, very important, very influential evolutionists. This is Mike Lynch, which I love reading Mike Lynch's papers. But he and colleagues wrote an article, just got published, The Genome-Wide Signature of Short-Term Temporal Selection. So we're going to look at evidence of natural selection across a genome. So they're sequencing genomes of organisms, multiple organisms in multiple different populations. They're looking at something called Daphnia, or the water flea. No, it doesn't bite. It's this little teeny crustacean, it's almost microscopic, that lives in waterways all across North America. I assume South America also, I'm not certain. But it's Daphnia. It's a very common laboratory organism because it has multiple generations per year. It's clonal mostly. In other words, the females just produce daughters mostly, but then they go through bouts of sexual recombination and sexual development, and then they go clonal again. So it's a really interesting organism, and they're studying this in, I think, 10 different natural populations. So they're looking at, okay, here's nature. Let's look at natural selection in this well-studied, well-characterized species over real time. And man, the things that they're going to say are incredible. I mean, absolutely incredible as they go and contradict the last 100 years of work on natural selection. However, the first thing I notice in this paper is that the writing is really thick. I mean, unusually so. Sometimes scientific jargon can be hard, but this paper has some classic phrases. Let me read to you just one example of a sentence. Notably, in the analyses of the genome-wide temporal covariance of allele frequency change in a natural population of D. melanogaster, Using data from Berglund et al., Buffalo and Coop, and Bertrand, found a similar pattern to that reported in Figure 2, on average weak but negative covariance over the shortest interval and near zero covariance thereafter. All right, did you understand that? I actually understood it, especially after I read it a couple of times. I think there might be missing a verb in there somewhere, I'm not sure. But I'm trying to parse the sentence. Okay, I got it. We're going to unpack that, and this is going to open up a world of interesting possibilities and a huge contradiction to an awful lot. I mean, hundreds, if not thousands, of scientific papers that have already been published. But let's summarize the paper before we dig into that long, obtuse quote. Let me just give you a couple of quotes from the paper. Now, what I'm doing is I read through the paper and I grabbed sentences that are all on a similar theme. So this is not going to be in order through the paper, but I put things together because they said something over here and they said something similar over there. When you put those two sentences together, whoa, that's a very powerful statement. They're talking here, and this is what I'm about to read, about 3 different species. So Daphnia, and then the fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, and another one. They say, observations from at least 3 species are consistent with the hypothesis of significant fluctuations in selection intensities operating at the level of nucleotide sites, often with very little autocorrelation in selection across years. You know, I have got competing interests that are supporting me here on Biblical Genetics. And for my supporters, thank you so much. If you'd like to become a supporter of this show, there'll be links in the show notes, either on patreon.com or buymeacoffee.com. But I have different people telling me different things. Some people are saying, Carter, give us all the gritty details, go full nerd and get up there and just tell us all this stuff. And other people are saying, no, Rob, take the cookies and put them on the bottom shelf. And yes, the person who tells me this has told me this many times, is one of my actually biggest financial supporters. So what I'm going to try to do is hit both worlds. I'm going to read you the complex, convoluted sentence, and I'm going to try to reinterpret it so that we can understand it. Let's read this again. Observations from at least 3 species, so this is a general thing, are consistent with the hypothesis of significant fluctuations in selection intensities. In other words, at one time period, selection might push a species in one direction, but another time period, it might push it in another direction. Well, what do we do with that? Well, we realize that any evolutionary paper done over a short time period might be invalid. That's what they're saying. That fluctuating selection intensities ruin everything. Not only do they fluctuate, but when you're looking at the nucleotide sites, operating at the level of nucleotide sites, so one letter in the genome, maybe blue eyes or something makes you tall, or the inability to digest lactose or whatever it might be, the selection intensity changes over time. So sometimes selection might be pushing something in one direction, and other times it might be pushing it in a different direction. Often with very little autocorrelation in selection across years, means that from one year to the next, you cannot see the same direction of change. That's odd. I thought, selection would constantly be pushing something in some direction. They say, no, sometimes it goes one way, sometimes it goes back again. Maybe it goes further in the other direction and comes back again. So you get fluctuation. Another quote. The chromosomal targets of selection shift over ecologically relevant timescales. So if you have a gene in this place, it might be being selected for, but a gene in a different place on the same chromosome or in a different chromosome, maybe that one's being selected the next season or the next year or 10 years later. So selection is like trying to put out multiple brush fires. It runs over here and tamps something down, another one pops up. It runs over there, tries to put that one down, the first one pops up again. It runs over there, and meanwhile a third one pops up. Natural selection can't handle that. I've said this before in this channel, natural selection needs a very clear signal. If the signal isn't clear, it is ineffective. And the environment makes everything really murky as far as natural selection is concerned. So what they're saying is that natural environmental fluctuations cause natural selection to flip back and forth. So the long-term selection coefficient, in other words, the measurement of selection, how much of an effect does it have, at any one particular site is usually close to 0. Close to 0, Mr. Darwin. Yeah, selection might be going one direction one year, but it might be coming back the other, and the average is 0. Most sites, even though they have an effect on the organism, have no long-term effect. That's not supposed to be true, but this is what they're saying. They also conclude that selection can't be considered independently of neighboring letters. In other words, if there's an important gene that's being selected for, everything around it is coming along with it. And there might be competing things in that block of DNA. If something wants to make the organism taller, well, there might be something makes the organism shorter, or taller versus I can digest lactose or not, or whatever it might be. There's combinations of traits that are inherited as blocks because DNA is inherited in a chunky manner because of sexual reproduction. Because chromosomal recombination happens only a couple of times in each chromosome, so neighboring genes tend to be inherited together. And so you get competition within a DNA block. And that's good news for the creationists, because the most sophisticated evolutionary modeling program written to date, as far as I'm aware, is a program called Mendel's Accountant. It was written by creationists in order to test evolutionary theory. And it is profound and powerful. In fact, I wrote a summary article called A Successful Decade for Mendel's Accountant, which you can find on creation.com. That paper just summarizes multiple studies and multiple conclusions and discoveries that were made using Mendel's Accountant. But Mendel's Accountant takes a shortcut. If you're going to model, say, the human genome or human population, it doesn't model 3 billion letters. In fact, each individual carries 2 copies, so it doesn't model 6 billion letters per individual. Instead, it takes a shortcut by dividing the genome up into blocks. And so here's a bunch of blocks or bins. You might say 1,000 bins in the genome, or 10,000, or you pick your number. That's a certain number of blocks, and then recombination happens between the blocks only. So if a mutation occurs, it gets put into a block, and another mutation might go into the same block, and they might compete. You might get opposite direction mutations in the same area. That's a shortcut that Mendel's Accountant made, and that's exactly what Lynch et al. Are saying is important. So thank you, Mr. Lynch, for validating one of the most important aspects of that very powerful computer program. In fact, you get competition within a block because of biology. Okay. They also warn that many thousands of evolutionary papers are seriously flawed. This is amazing. They wrote, most empirical studies in molecular population genetics, that is, studies that are looking at DNA inheriting over time and seeing what's changing or not. Most empirical studies in molecular population genetics implicitly assume that fluctuating selection is of negligible significance. And what they're showing in this paper is that it is of profound significance. Fluctuating selection may play just as substantial role as the effects of finite population size in determining the fate of mutant alleles. What's finite population size? They're getting at something called genetic drift. That is, in really small populations, you can have a very fast change in the alleles, the variations of genes, just because of random chance. So if you had a population of 100 individuals, and let's say 5 of them carried something that was bad, maybe hereditary blindness or some bad gene, the probability of exactly 5 individuals in the next population, the next generation, having that gene is pretty small, because it'd be easy for one of those individuals who just carries it, they're not actually blind, they just carry the gene, to have 2 surviving offspring, or only 1 or 0. And when you have 5 chances of that, you might get in the next generation 10 individuals that have the gene, or 0, or 7, or 3. I mean, flip a coin a bunch of times, you're going to get bunches of heads or bunches of tails. That's what happens in probability. So in small populations, you can have really fast change in the gene content. The alleles can shift radically. That's called genetic drift. Here they're saying that fluctuating selection in large populations has as profound an effect of genetic drift in small populations. And I'm not aware that anyone has ever written that before. I'm not aware that anyone's discovered that before. Therefore, you can get fast change, and it might look like natural selection, but it's not. Despite this conceptual problem, hundreds of studies have interpreted patterns of population genetic variation in terms of drift, mutation, and deterministic selection. What they're saying is that those hundreds of studies are wrong, or at least potentially wrong, and almost all of them are ignoring the effect of the environment changing over time, cyclically, in patterns, El Nino, La Nina, summer, winter, whatever it might be. Hundreds of studies have interpreted their results in terms of drift, mutation, deterministic selection, and they're probably all wrong. This can lead to the false impression of relaxed selection or strong balancing selection. The false impression. So those hundreds, probably thousands of scientific experiments that have claimed we see evidence of natural selection are balderdash. That's what they're saying. Oh, this is genius level writing here. And before I get to the next quote, I want to explain something called covariance. When you have genes that are spread out in the genome, they might change in the same direction at the same time. That's called covariance. There are things that are polygenic. There are traits that are involved, many different genes are involved in a trait, like height. A lot of different genes influence height. Or intelligence. A lot of things influence intelligence. Or skin color. In the European population, a lot of people have light skin. There's not just one light skin gene. There are dozens of genes that affect skin color. And in the European population, we see all of them change in a significant similar direction. Oh, does that not mean that natural selection is operating genome-wide on light skin color, and anything that contributes to light skin color will be selected for? It has been argued that significant genome-wide covariance of allele frequency change is an indicator of pervasive selection on polygenic traits. Do you understand that? In the absence of information on the identity of selected sites, the meaning of such measures remains unclear. Did you see that? They're putting a knife in the back of Darwinists and Darwinian evolution and natural selection theory. They're saying that a lot of studies have determined pervasive selection on polygenic traits like, skin color. But in the absence of information, the identity of selected sites, the meaning of such measures remains unclear. To put it lightly. But shockingly, absolutely shockingly, this paper starts off with the no true Scotsman fallacy, the literal definition of the no true Scotsman fallacy. The opening line, no biologist needs convincing that natural selection is a powerful force influencing essentially all organisms. Is that true? Oh, it's no true biologist would ever say, oh no, natural selection is not powerful. This is unbelievable. No biologist needs convincing. They're speaking to their audience. They've just written something that all the evolutionary biologists are going to be like, yeah, that's right. No biologist would ever say that natural selection is not a powerful force influencing essentially all organisms. Of course not, because that's Darwinian evolution right there. But then they spend the rest of the paper saying that that statement is wrong. This is amazing. This writing is beautiful. It is poetic. In fact, this last one I'm going to quote from the paper is absolute poetry. They highlight a big problem in the field of ecology. In fact, the biggest problem. And I am an ecologist. My PhD is in coral reef ecology. So I understand this. And they just lay it out. Although science increasingly relies on rapid experimental analyses, nature proceeds at its own pace. Oh, that is beautiful. And that is very true. Science, because of the publish or perish mentality, because a scientist only has a couple of years of productive work and he wants to make an impact, because science is always trying to find model organisms that are easy to manipulate and that change fast, like Daphnia or fruit flies, things you can have multiple generations at a time, E. coli, things that you can apply things to and learn a lot really quickly. Now I understand why this is true, and in science I agree that this is something that should be done, except you also have to do the opposite. You also have to do long-term studies. But nature proceeds at its own pace. And nature is fickle. if I could personify nature. Natural forces are variable. And we have all these competing things within an organism, and natural selection doesn't necessarily know which one to pick. And it might pick one thing one year and one thing the next, or one season or the next, one generation or the next generation. And so we see, as their conclusions say, that the net effect of natural selection on most genetic variants is 0. Despite the fact that many hundreds or thousands of studies have concluded that selection is either positive or negative on that same site. Because when you expand the analysis over long periods of time, you see no change. And that's what they saw in these populations of water fleas. No net change, even though they had, from one season to the next, significant changes in allele frequencies that would have been misinterpreted as natural selection by other people. So much for most every experiment ever done in the field of ecology. I'm going to wrap up here with a quote from The Origin of Species, so we can see what they just did to Darwinism. Darwin wrote on page 109 of his first edition of The Origin of Species, "Slow though the process of selection may be, I can see no limit to the amount of change, which may be effected in the long course of time by nature's power of selection." So what do you think? Is that true? Given enough time, even though selection is weak, even though Darwin was never able to actually prove this hypothesis using observation or math, and he failed to write this book, is it true that given enough time, that natural selection is going to cause change? Let me read you one of the early quotes from this paper. "Allelic variants have temporal average selection coefficients close to 0. So no, Darwin, given enough time, it's not actually going to work. Time has always been a rescue mechanism for evolution, but time is not actually the friend of evolution, because we have the buildup of slightly deleterious mutations that are not powerful enough for natural selection to even see, that cause a slow winnowing of genomes, a slow decline in genomic health over time. We see that. And we don't see long-term selection causing significant change. I mean, this is Darwin's brainchild, that natural selection can do anything, but he didn't have a molecular basis for it, which is where molecular biology comes in. I mean, they want DNA to be changing over time, and yet when you combine the ecology with genetics, everything breaks down. So there's going to be a lot more to say in this subject. I'm just happy that they published this. I'm happy that I could mostly understand it, and I hope I've explained it well enough to you. I really do hope so. Try to take those cookies off the top shelf and put them on the bottom shelf for you to understand that natural selection, even though it's real and it's not a fake thing, it does work, but it only works on profound variants. You know, sickle cell anemia in Central Africa helps people survive malaria. Therefore, they're more likely to survive to adulthood to have children. Okay. You know, all sorts of other things that have a big effect, natural selection can act on them. But anything with a moderate to light effect, natural selection is blind, because these effects don't, these alleles don't have a great enough effect on the organism to really affect life and death, or to really affect reproductive output. And that's the great majority of the letters in the genome. The evolutionists for a century now have been focusing on things that have big effects. Yeah, those exist, fine. But that's not where evolution has to happen. Evolution has to happen across the entire genome, not just one letter. And also, as Walter Remine pointed out, if you have one letter being selected, then that's the only one that can be selected. You can't have 2 or 3 or 4 at the same time, because then natural selection gets confused on which one it should be working on to, again, personify natural selection, because it's just easier to do that. It makes my sentences much shorter when I get to personify natural selection. So forgive me for doing that. It's just the way human language works. It just makes it so much easier. Anyway, I'm rambling now, so I'm going to stop. Thank you so much for watching. Again, links for support in the show notes. Please go and watch some of my other episodes. There's going to be more on this. In fact, I think my next one is going to be on the genomics of woolly mammoths, the last remaining woolly mammoths. Another brand new paper came out that's also going to influence our understanding of the created kind, bottlenecks, and all sorts of other things. And it's going to piggyback on this. Have a wonderful day. Be encouraged. Evolution actually is false.